Welcome to CSA Global. My name is Sam Ulrich. I'm a Principal Consultant in CSA Global's corporate team based in Perth, Australia. This is the first in a series of short presentations providing an introduction to greenhouse gas emissions in gold mining, the increasing demand for and disclosure of climate risks which are linked to emissions reporting. However, many of the items discussed are directly applicable to other mined commodities. Mining is an important industry, and many of the products it produces will be essential for the world to transition to a low-carbon economy. The World Bank this year published a report titled Minerals for Climate Action, the Mineral Intensity of the Clean Energy Transition, which outlines which minerals it considers critical to build the clean energy infrastructure required to limit global warming to at or below 2 degrees centigrade. To understand greenhouse gas emissions in mining, we need to know the energy sources for the mining operation. Is electricity generated on-site by diesel or gas? Are renewables such as solar and wind included within that energy mix? If electricity is grid supplied, how was it generated? Hydroelectricity, nuclear, gas, coal, etc. The mining fleet, is it all diesel powered or are electric fleet used? Mining itself is energy, greenhouse gas emissions and water intensive, putting itself at risk to a changing climate. Climate risks are financial risks in mining. The demand for greater disclosure on companies' financial exposure to climate-related risks is increasing, with pressure coming from many different stakeholders. The Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, seeks to develop recommendations for voluntary climate-related financial disclosures that are consistent, comparable, reliable, clear, and efficient, and provide decision-useful information to lenders, insurers, and investors. Over 1,000 global organizations have declared their support for the TCFD's recommendations, representing $12 trillion in market capitalization. Why is this important? Better access to data will enhance how climate-related risks are assessed, priced, and managed. Companies can more effectively measure and evaluate their own risks and those of their suppliers and competitors. Investors will make better informed decisions on where and how they want to allocate their capital. Lenders, insurers, and underwriters will be better able to evaluate their risks and exposures over the short, medium, and long term. Greenhouse gas emissions and water are two key environmental aspects in mining when addressing climate risks. They need to be addressed in relation to the TCFD's core elements of climate-related financial disclosure: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, this can involve running climate scenario analyses, disclosing inherent risks and how they will be managed, reporting greenhouse gas emissions metrics, and setting reduction targets. Groundwater scarcity is an inherent climate change risk, where decreased average annual rainfall causes drier surface conditions and underground aquifers to be replenished slowly. This can cause water competition in scarce areas. This can lead to community opposition, unwanted environmental and reputational impacts, difficulty in obtaining water extraction licenses, curtailing expansion or development plans, a loss of production, increased costs on potential lower revenue. CSA Global has an excellent team providing water management services to established and new mine sites all over the globe. Government-enforced regulatory change is another inherent climate change risk, causing costs to increase through increased regulatory compliance and charges, such as the introduction of a carbon tax or emissions trading scheme, ETS, increased compliance obligations and removal of fossil fuel subsidies, for example the fuel tax credit in Australia, reputational impacts from failing to appropriately manage and disclose climate-related risks, the reporting of Scope 3 emissions becoming mandatory, having to develop a Scope 3 emissions inventory and its potential impact. The main greenhouse gas emissions are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, which when bundled together are presented as a carbon dioxide equivalent. The carbon dioxide equivalent can also include hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, and nitrogen trifluoride. Greenhouse gas emissions are divided into three scopes and are explained here with respect to the gold supply chain. Scope 1 are direct greenhouse gas emissions related to the activity of gold mining, such as on-site electricity generation, mining, processing, concentrating, and smelting to produce gold or doré bars. Scope 2 are indirect greenhouse gas emissions from the indirect consumption of energy, such as grid-supplied electricity. Scope 3 are other indirect greenhouse gas emissions, which occur as a consequence of gold mining, but are from sources not owned or controlled by the gold mine owner. This can include upstream emissions from the transport of goods or the flying in and out of workers to the mine, and downstream emissions such as the recycling of e-waste, the investment and storage of gold bullion, and manufacture of electronics and jewellery. To put greenhouse gas emissions from gold mining into perspective, we can compare the total greenhouse gas emissions footprint from the total world gold production in 2018 with just BHP's metallurgical coal production in their 2019 financial year, which have similar levels of total greenhouse gas emissions. 126 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent versus 116 million tonnes. However, coal has significant Scope 3 emissions through its combustion. World gold production was 3,500 tonnes, which generated total estimated greenhouse gas emissions of 126 million tonnes CO2 equivalent and revenue of $143 billion. BHP's metallurgical coal production was 42 million tonnes, which generated total estimated greenhouse gas emissions of 116 million tonnes CO2 equivalent and revenue of $7.5 billion. Also presented are some greenhouse gas emissions intensities, which show that on a per tonne of product comparison, gold is very carbon intensive compared to coal. However, as gold is a high value commodity, it has a high revenue intensity compared to coal. How well are greenhouse gas emissions reported in the gold industry? There are over 500 companies that produce gold. Approximately 60 of those companies, whose primary commodity is gold, report Scopes 1 and 2 emissions. Only a few report Scope 3 emissions. Those 60 companies report emissions for approximately 200 gold mines out of over 850 mines that produce gold. The gold production from those 200 mines accounted for approximately 44% of the total world's gold production in 2018. Even though only a small number of companies are presently reporting greenhouse gas emissions, they account for nearly half of the world's total gold production. In addition to companies reporting their total Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, they commonly also report a greenhouse gas emissions intensity. There are two different greenhouse gas emissions intensities reported in gold mining. Greenhouse gas emissions reported by gold or gold equivalent ounces produced, or reported by ore tonnes processed, with most companies only reporting one. Depending on which emissions intensity is selected, different interpretations will result. Underground mines have the lower and open pit mines the higher emissions intensities when it is reported by gold ounces produced, with the opposite true for emissions intensities reported by ore tonnes processed. The emissions intensity per ounce is affected by a change in gold grade, where an increased gold grade leads to lower emissions intensity and vice versa. It is related to the saleable product gold. It allows you to produce revenue and earnings emissions intensities, which allows comparison between different commodities and industries. Whereas the emissions intensity per ore tonne processed is not affected by changes in gold grade, nor directly relatable to the saleable product. Both intensities have their advantages, and using them together allows a more robust interpretation of why a change in emissions intensity has occurred, whether it be a change in operating conditions or actual measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Stay tuned for future presentations in the series, where I delve deeper into greenhouse gas emissions in gold mining in Australia and globally. Investigate the impact a hypothetical carbon tax would have on the gold industry in terms of costs in different jurisdictions, and look at the methods companies are using to abate their greenhouse gas emissions and heading towards a greener future for gold mining. Thank you for listening.